Welcome to Research Exchange, where evidence meets understanding. I'm your host, Laeeq Khan. My guest today is Dr. Ronald Yaros, Associate Professor of Digital Engagement at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. He's also the Director of the Digital Engagement Lab and an Affiliate Associate Professor at the University of Maryland's College of Information. He's spent nearly 2 decades studying the micro-level processes people use to seek, select, and share digital information. And his new book, The Digital Engagement Model: How to Capture and Keep Audience Attention, is a culmination of all of that work. Before earning his doctorate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Yaros was an Emmy Award-winning broadcast meteorologist and science reporter, and later served as president of a national educational software company. Ron, welcome to Research Exchange. Really glad to have you here today.
Thank you very much. It's exciting to be here.
Great. So you've been building this engagement model since around 2005. That's a long time to stay focused on one question, and this is a question of importance. What were journalists and researchers getting wrong about audiences back then that made you want to rethink the whole thing?
It's not so much that they were getting something wrong. It's something that popped into my mind. Actually, it was the very first meeting in my PhD program as I was arriving as a student, a non-traditional student because I was slightly older than everyone else. But I began to say to myself, okay, as we're listening to all these professors talk about the effects of media, and the reactions to them and the tracking of engagement of the audience when it comes to things like political participation and so forth, I began to ask myself, how do we really know they're being engaged?
Mhm.
And does that level of engagement really influence what we're hearing here in the research? That is, okay, we know that certain people might respond to certain things online, but do we really take into account the broad audience, the diverse audience that's exposed to the content? Not only that, but that was about the time, 2005, well, actually 2007, especially when mobile technology arrived. We had already been exposed and we were using the internet. So it was also the technology that began to get me very interested in, again, not what journalists are doing wrong, but how they could improve their reaching out to the general audiences and not focus just on a small portion of that audience.
Great. So it really was, as I understand it, bottom-up rethinking, starting with what the users themselves rather than the content, right? And
Exactly.
that's a pretty significant shift, which leads me to something that I think will surprise a lot of people watching this. So I'm going to ask you this. Most content creators, which includes journalists, marketers, educators, are obsessed with what they publish. The story, the headline, the format, and the visuals, they're important, they matter. But your research says that when and where someone encounters content also matters, just as much as the content itself. So why do those variables get so consistently overlooked?
That's a good question. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we have this mindset of making sure that our content is well written or well produced, and that it's accurate, and that we're following the journalism ethics. All those things are important. The tenets of journalism are still in place. I'm not challenging any of that. I am more concerned about how the information is engaging a larger audience. So I think that one of the things that we fall into a habit is concentrating only on how we're writing or producing video, or only on our sources and how we're going to what our headline is going to say and so forth. We're not really thinking that now, especially with mobile devices, we've got audiences that are going to want that information, but maybe they don't have the time to completely comprehend it.
Mhm.
And so I'm more concerned about varying the presentation of content so it matches and reaches the audiences where they are at that moment. Gone, of
Mhm.
course, are the times when We sat around for 30 minutes watching Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, every evening, or looking at the New York Times and looking at the finite number of pages. Now we obviously have billions of pages to search. So that's where I was beginning to think that maybe journalists need to, not only journalists, but educators as well, any communicator should probably begin to look at the structure of their content and see how they can bring in more people from some of those outlying areas.
Great. And we live in a fascinating times, don't we? So what you share is a very grounding point, I would say. And I think it reframes the whole conversation around why some content fails even when it's really good, right? There's so much content out there, but not all of it is going to succeed in grabbing our attention. Now, I want to get into something that your research gets very specific about. And so we live in the world of infinite content, right? Content all around us, very fast, very dynamic. Shrinking attention spans is another challenge I would say we have to deal with. So, what does your research actually say about what keeps people reading, watching, listening past those first few seconds? What is happening cognitively in that moment?
Well, I'm going to challenge one thing that you said, and that is attention spans are
Hmm.
shrinking. And of course, if they were, we would not have anyone watching any movies or 30-minute television shows or reading a book or, engage with some of the other communication activity that does really give us the opportunity to watch something happen, a linear program. And there, of course, there are certain people who are still into long form journalism, which is alive and well, and I'm going to argue that it should
Hmm.
continue especially if they adopt the structure I'm going to talk about. But it's not necessarily, in my mind, the attention span. It is, after teaching students in particular online for the last several years, it's how the information is presented.
Hmm.
And we all know, unfortunately, that there are plenty of examples of younger people who are spending literally hours on TikTok on Instagram, on social media. Well, that's not an attention span problem. That is the benefits of presenting information in chunks in certain ways. Obviously, it's entertaining. We know the number one reason why students are going to engage with social media is entertaining, maybe also sports. But the point is, it is how that content is structured.
Hmm.
And if we're going to talk about things like nanotechnology and climate change, we're not going to be as entertaining as TikTok. I know that. But we need to do a better job presenting this information in a way that will not only catch their attention in those first few seconds, as you talked about, but then suddenly it begins to build what I call attention momentum. And that is for those people who have the time and interest to consume, we're going to make it very easy. The content will adapt to their ability to look for what they want for as long as they want to read it or view it, and it adapts to their behavior. It's a lot different than, oh, this is a really cool headline. I'm going to click on it and it's a full page of text. It's a linear text. I want to know something specific out of that text because the headline caught my attention. Now I've got to look for it in that text, read the entire thing before I realize this is important and this is what is interesting to me. If we can get smaller chunks to people quicker,
Hmm.
we are going to allow them to make that decision that this is of interest to me. This is information. It's not clickbait. It is something I can use. It is something that I can quickly find in the content. So that's how it relates to structure.
I love that. I mean, so much of that resonates so much with how I've been thinking about it. I really appreciate the terminology around and the understanding around attention momentum. I love it. Love that concept. It's so much more reflective of how it really is, contrary to what we see in the popular media, where people are mostly talking about attention span. But this is, I truly believe, a better way to look at it. So it's almost like content has its own physics. And you've actually been able to watch that happen in the lab, which brings me to my next question. So you've used eye tracking technology to literally watch how people read digital content. What is the most surprising thing you've seen? Something that genuinely changed the way you think about storytelling or content design?
What I really found interesting, because we were comparing health news
Mhm.
with a new version of the health news that used what we call explanatory graphics. And so, what I found very interesting is the importance of explaining something as quickly as possible, not only in graphics, but in data visualizations and even in photographs. So, for example, in my class, say to my students, yeah, everyone takes a photo. Why is Professor Yaros wasting my time telling me how to take a photo? Well, most of the photos are what I call point and shoot.
Mhm.
Here is the building. Here's my selfie. Here is, you name it, any type of scenario. An explanatory photo is something that will place that scene into context. So I say, okay, it's not just the primary scene. For instance, I show them the Pulitzer Prize winning photo from the New York Times that shows a pyramid in the distance, but in the foreground, a person on a motorcycle, airborne, jumping in the air. I said, if you just looked at the pyramid, that's point and shoot. If you looked at just the motorcycle, it's point and shoot. But if you've got both of those things in your photo, take a moment, look around, make sure you can place your item into context. You're going to really be able to communicate information without the person even having to read a caption, because there's a person on a motorcycle airborne in Egypt. It tells the story without any text. Similarly, with eye tracking, we found that if we have explanatory graphics, something that will be designed so it's not necessarily pretty or
Mhm.
colorful. In some cases, data visualization is very complex, and
Mhm.
it would take several minutes for a person to really probe all of the possibilities in that data. And if they've got the time, again, that's great. But if they don't, how can we communicate more important information? In this case, it was health information to someone who may not want or need to read the entire page. So, what we found is that those that are exposed to explanatory photos, explanatory graphics, came away with much more information and
Mhm.
were able to recall some of the critical things that were being expressed in the photograph or in the graphic. So, we really don't want to downplay the importance of these things. And again, one thing I'm seeing a lot on the news organization sites today is that you click on the headline, you see one photo, and then you scroll down and it's mainly text. Maybe
Mhm.
you'll see other photos, but many cases, these are photos of things I already know about. I already know how several politicians look. I don't need to see their picture again. Put it into context. Show me something that's related to what they're talking about. So explanatory photos and visualizations and graphics are what we found to be really important in our eye tracking research.
Superb. That's remarkable. So if I can just sum it up, so explanatory photos, visualizations, and explanations of those things, I think these are often overlooked, and no wonder we are having people not, just scrolling past a lot of content and they're not paying. So this is such important, I would say, million-dollar research that they can benefit from. Okay. So this today, a lot of people in journalism are concerned, especially both journalism and communicators, as if they're losing the battle to algorithms, to short form video, to shrinking newsrooms. So, does your research give them any reason for hope, or does it confirm their worst fears as to what's coming up next?
Yes, I argue that algorithms are excellent at distribution.
Hmm.
Algorithms do not structure the content. Algorithms do not necessarily look for ways to promote engagement. But at the same time, algorithms respond to engagement. So now structure once again becomes more important because we want to know, are they scrolling? Do they stop scrolling? Do they click? Do they stay? Do they finish? Do they share? Do they return? Do they comment? These are all things related to the structure. And once you get those things under control, now the algorithms are able to distribute that content based on the audience interaction and response. So if I were just writing today a full page of text on a very important news story and I put it online, it's not probably going to get a lot of those interactive things I just talked about, clicks and shares and likes. And so now we're fighting algorithms in a way of producing content that doesn't get any interaction. So we're back to the structure. If we can structure the content so it does promote interaction and interest and attention momentum,
Hmm.
the algorithms will take over because people are sharing and commenting and reacting to that content. So it's so important that we kind of feed the algorithm with content that is distributable.
Very true. So, and that's a very important distinction that you're making, and which also points to the agency that creators actually have in this. No matter they're dealing with algorithms or not, it's what they're doing. So, and I want to push into the AI question because I think that is where your research gets especially timely. So, you've been studying how people engage with content produced by both humans and AI. Now that AI generated news and content is everywhere, does the audience even notice the difference? What does the evidence actually say?
The evidence, I remember this one key thing that I was reading for the book, and that was researchers found that, at least for the sample they were testing, people could not tell the difference between human produced text and AI produced text. But
Hmm.
once they were informed that the AI text was indeed produced by AI, then they, of course, took more of a negative approach and they began to question the accuracy, which I argue should be always questioned, even if it's human produced. So, what's the
Hmm.
difference? But it's a mixed bag of response. I think that if a person really detects that this is AI, they are not necessarily going to respect it as much as human produced, researched, accurate news reporting. But at the same time, unfortunately, even for some of my students, of course, the research shows that they can't differentiate between the two.
Hmm.
So how do I combat that? At the very first meeting of my class, I ask everyone to write their own description of their own experience that AI would not know about. And during the course of the semester, I'll look at the writings that they submit and can, most often than not, tell that they are using AI because suddenly it does not match at all their style, their grammar, their syntax of the things they wrote earlier in the semester. So you can detect it if you do that type of research, but on its surface, just looking at it, it's very difficult to do. Now, another point I want to make, because this relates to our interface that we tested with 1,644 people nationwide. It was a diverse audience
Hmm.
of 18 to 70 years of age, and we exposed them to a news story on climate change. One version, your typical headline, photo, and full screen of text. The other one is what we call the Smart Story Suite, which allows people to select what they want immediately because either a human or AI has summarized that news story in chunks. It
Hmm.
doesn't just give you a paragraph or bullet points, it actually divides the long form piece into identifiable sections where, let's say, I already know something about that news story and I want to skip over that beginning part. I'm going to jump right to the latest information about that particular, maybe it's the war in Iran or something that is constantly changing. Um, we find that if you give the ability for students and news organizations, anyone who's consuming information, the agency to select what they want as opposed to being forced to read a linear text, they will definitely think it's more interactive,
Hmm.
more personalized, and interestingly enough, they spent less time on the Smart Story Suite, but they recalled more information. So now we're kind of challenging the old belief that, hey, a person spending a lot of time on that content is the one who's going to learn much more than someone who's not. And the evidence shows that if it's structured properly, it will be just fine. It will definitely recall, people recall more information. But the bottom line now, to close this answer, is that when students are told to think about AI, or even, the general public, we often fall into this assumption that AI only generates information, obviously generative AI. And when it generates information, we all know hallucinations and incorrect information will appear. what our Smart Story suite does, and it's a pretty complex Python coding, is it's constantly asking the AI tool to look at the original content that it is restructuring and to make sure it is not adding any new information. So it's strictly restructuring it. Now, it's not perfect. We've got 98 to 100% of the original content that's being used only because we have a little counter and on the right-hand side of the screen it shows here's how much of the original content was used. Sometimes it's 100%, sometimes it's 98%. And we're still trying to figure out, well, does it mean that it discarded some information because there was poor writing or there was an opportunity to improve the writing? But the point is, it's not generating any new information. It is restructuring it in a way that we have thought a model should present content. And so I think that if a person will continue to say forever, hey, I don't trust AI and I'm not going to really pay attention to it, or I don't think it has any future in education or journalism. Two things. One, I just described how it restructures, it doesn't generate anything new. And number two, it's going to be a lot different 5 years from today. It's going to be a lot smarter than today. To completely discard it as a useless tool today is kind of short-sighted because it's getting smarter every day, and I would argue it's going to improve. So I know it's a long way to answer your question about AI versus humans, but I wanted to give you two or three different examples of why we need to think about it.
No, very, very useful examples, and I'm so glad that you explained it in detail so for our audiences so that they can unpack what this actually means coming from a researcher. So that really
Thank you.
matters. Thank you for that. So your work pulls from journalism, psychology, neuroscience, and technology, as I can tell. When you sit down with practicing journalists or newsroom leaders, what's the one finding they find hardest to accept in this new mix of reality, the new reality that we're facing?
I think their first reaction, which is justifiable, is if I were to get these news stories in a smart story suite, will my audience adapt to it? Is everyone so used to sitting down and seeing and occasionally reading, but not all the time, the full page of text? And would they be comfortable with a new way to present the content? And to be honest with you, that's what we're researching right now. To what extent would the audience, and in particular, the difference between older news consumers and younger news consumers, how might they approach this structure differently? And would, in particular, the next generation of news consumers, the younger adults on social media, would they respond better to this structure than the linear structure? And I think that's the main question, at least the ones that I get from journalists, is okay, that's pretty cool. I see how your AI tool immediately restructures this news story in 15 seconds or less. How do I know my audience will like it? So I think the answer is that we won't completely transform our news sites or our
Mhm.
mobile apps to that one structure, but we'll dabble, we'll test, we'll A/B test it. And so that's the next stage. And I think, that is the main concern that they bring up.
Great, great. Fascinating insights. So let me close with something practical because I know a lot of people watching this video are going to be content creators themselves. If someone watching this right now, a journalist, a communicator, educator, anyone, and like I said, content creators who do this for a living, could take one thing away from your research and actually use it tomorrow, what would that be?
Okay, I've got my story done and it's really well written. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning story, but as one of my former professors said, even a Pulitzer Prize story doesn't mean not anything if no one reads it, right? So I've got that done. And the first thing I'm going to ask myself is, what happens if someone really is interested in this, but a meeting is about to start, or the stoplight turns green, or the plane is about to board? What can I do in my structure that will facilitate communication of at least some information as opposed to completely turning people off? Because when someone looks at a page and they leave, the audience analytics teams call that a bounce, the high bounce rate. We've got bounce rates of 50
Mhm.
to 60%. That's the percentage of people who look at something and they're gone. How do I make my content so that someone can read an explanatory headline, something that will communicate useful information,
Mhm.
bullet points that will summarize, we know cognitively immediately summarizes, and explanatory subheads. That means in the middle of the text to give me declarative sentences that if I'm a scanner, I'm still going to get a very good idea from the story without having to read all of the text. So those are just some of the very simple things that a person can do before they post that information.
Very useful, research grounded empirical advice. Thank you so much, Ron. This has
Thank
been
you.
such a rich conversation. The idea that engagement doesn't start with the content, it starts with the person encountering it, is one of those things that sounds obvious once you hear it, and yet completely changes how you think about your work. Thank you for sharing your research with us today. And to everyone watching, whether you're a journalist trying to reach a broader audience, an educator rethinking how you want to present information, or a healthcare communicator trying to get people to actually read what you put in front of them, this is valuable advice. It's golden advice. I hope this conversation gave you something you can take back to your work. If it did, and I'm sure it did, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this episode with a colleague. And until next time, keep asking questions and keep following the evidence, and you'll see us in the next episode of Research Exchange. I'm Dr. Laeeq Khan. Until next time, thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of the day. And thank you, Ron.